All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Port Huron Odyssey House Stigma Prevention Project Educational Series. I'm Alicia Fay. Today's speaker is Nicole Hutchinson. Nicole is a licensed bachelor's social worker and certified drug and alcohol counselor. She's been working in the SUD field for 9 years. Nicole is currently the program coordinator for Grandma's House Family Involvement Center, part of Flint Odyssey House, as well as a clinician working with individuals who are recovering from substance use disorder. Nicole started her college journey in a sign language interpreter program before changing her focus to social work. Nicole has experience working with deaf individuals in an SUD setting. She's been involved in the deaf community on and off since 2000 and is passionate about providing equal access to services. We ask that you please remain muted for the presentation. You guys can have your cameras on or off, whichever is your preference. The presentation will be recorded and posted on the Flint Odyssey House YouTube channel. Only the live version today, though, will be eligible for the McBAP educational credit. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat or save them until the end when we'll have time for a question and answer. At the conclusion of today's presentation, we will share a link to an evaluation survey. Completing this will provide you with your certificate of attendance. And I'm going to go ahead and give the floor over to Nicole, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Alicia. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. So, and just, I'm going to try to keep my eyes on the chat and answer things as I can throughout so that then we don't get to the end and maybe some questions would have made more sense at the time. Okay, so providing SUD services within the deaf and hard of hearing community. Sorry, I have two screens, so I'm trying to get it to work with me. Okay, so our learning objectives for today are introduction to the deaf and hard of hearing community, SUD in the deaf community, and recipient rights and ADA laws. So just as a little side note, this is meant to be an introduction to and not a end all be all inclusive information. Okay, introduction to the deaf and hard of hearing community. So what is the deaf and hard of hearing community? The deaf and hard of hearing community is made up primarily of people who identify as deaf or hard of hearing. However, the community also involves CODAs, which is child or children of deaf adults, other family members, friends, and interpreters. The deaf and hard of hearing community has its own culture, history, and language. And 90% of deaf infants are born to hearing parents. And so that can have a huge impact on various things in their life. So as far as one of the big things is if it's not detected right away, I mean, think about all of the things that children learn from hearing and their environment, even just, hearing other conversations. There's various causes of deafness. So a child can be born deaf or have hard of hearing. It can be due to illness, injury, and then we talked about like the early detection because of building language and effective communication. Also, it impacts the bond between the parent and child or caregiver. So there's a difference between a lowercase d and a capital D for deaf. So somebody who identifies as deaf as far as being part of deaf culture, you're going to use the big D. It's capitalized as a proper noun. So that would be deafness as a social cultural perspective. The sign language is their primary form of communication, and they're immersed in the deaf culture. So often you will see that like people who their entire world seems to be involved in the deaf community. So people who might go to Michigan School for the Deaf, Gallaudet, which is the deaf college in Washington, D.C. And then little d is deafness could be perceived as an impairment, not using sign language as a primary form of communication, and primarily integrated into the hearing community. So this could also be somebody who maybe lost their hearing later on in life, an elderly person. And we'll get into more of that as well here in the next slide. So some do's and don'ts as far as wording or labels. So do use deaf with a capital D, so long as that's how the person identifies. Using the term hard of hearing, and deaf blind, which is somebody who is both deaf and blind, and so they would also use a different form of sign language, where it's called tactile, where you would actually sign in the person's hands where they can feel the hand shapes that you're making. And then late deafened, which would be somebody who either maybe they lost their hearing to an illness later on in life, but then embraced deaf culture. So things that we don't want to use are deaf mute, deaf and dumb, or hearing impaired. And I put an asterisk with hearing impaired because some people will identify as hearing impaired, and if that's what they identify with, then obviously, person-centered, we're going to use what they identify with. But being careful to use that language or ask how they identify. Somebody who is deaf and in the deaf culture and is very proud of their deafness, hearing impaired is a more of a slanderous, or I guess you could say maybe even a slur, like it's not strengths-based. So some of that also is, so hard of hearing are individuals who have some residual hearing but are not completely deaf. Some of these clients also depend on lip reading, an oral interpreter, or sign language interpreter. So some people might have residual hearing but still identify as deaf. So again, it's very much asking how they identify. Late deafened adult, people who lose their hearing typically in adulthood after functioning auditorily. So it could even be somebody who maybe as a older child, teenager, so they were hearing for a good portion of their life and then lost their hearing for some reason. Okay. So etiquette. When working with somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing, do not shout, do not over enunciate, don't speak slowly, just talk normally. People who use lip reading, if you are over enunciating or speaking slowly, it's going to make it more difficult for them to try to lip read versus your natural speaking. Don't treat the person like they're unintelligent. Don't ask if they can read or write. I mean, obviously in this profession, we are sometimes going to ask what their limitations are, but don't make that as part of the conversation about their deafness. Don't ask things like, can you drive? How did you get through life with a disability? So a lot of those things are going to be, stigma creating and make the person feel less than. Do not stare at someone who is using sign language. So if you see people out in the community, or let's say you have a new client come in and they're with the interpreter and they're chit-chatting beforehand, don't stare. If you're trying to get the person's attention, do not poke, jab, or throw things at them to get their attention. The best way to get someone's attention is to either wave your hand, if you guys can see me, kind of wave your hand in their direction towards them, not right in their face. If you're sitting at a table, you can tap the table to make it vibrate, stomp your foot politely to kind of make the floor vibrate to get their attention. Do not apologize to someone for their being deaf or make comments about praying for them because of deafness or other information about how they can fix or cure their deafness. So again, that just kind of makes it seem like they are less than, there's something wrong with them, they need to be fixed, and we want to avoid that kind of language. Don't say things like, but you can talk, but you can read lips, you're too pretty to be deaf, I would never want to be deaf. Again, a lot of those create more stigma. I know sometimes some of these comments are well-intended, but just taking a step back and thinking about how they could be perceived. Oh,
We have a question, Nicole.
yep, I see it. I just thought, okay, so Megan asked if somebody, if an individual with residual hearing would be someone who relies on a hearing device. So that's very much a personal choice. Somebody with residual hearing may use hearing aids, and I have a slide too. It's the next slide actually that talks a little more about language and devices. So somebody with residual hearing might use a hearing device, they might not. And also, just because we see somebody with hearing aids also doesn't mean that they use sign language either. It's all very much a personal choice, and also it depends on various things such as when they became, when they lost their hearing, became deaf or hard of hearing. If it was as a child, it kind of depends too on what choices their parents made and what they grew up with. And then also as they get older, that also might change how they decide to do things. Does that answer your question, Megan?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. Okay. There we go. Okay, so language. So there is American Sign Language is the main type of sign language that you will see people use. And then there's also something called signed exact English. So American Sign Language is more visual. So the person interpreting or how the language is it's more concept based, more visual. So there's not necessarily a sign for every word. And it's similar to, like, if anybody has taken any other foreign language, the word order sometimes is different than how English is. And so American Sign Language is the same. It's not going to be word for word. Whereas signed exact English it's going to be word for word, every single word. So like my name is, and American Sign Language would be my name, because it's more concept based, not so focused on each word. So something to keep in mind with that is somebody who uses American Sign Language, English is not their first language. And so sometimes reading English can be difficult. Sometimes texting or writing back and forth, it might look like broken English. And that's sometimes where one of the reasons why some people may view a deaf or hard of hearing person as unintelligent is because it looks like, oh, they don't know English. Well, it's because that's not their first language, no different than somebody who speaks Spanish or Italian or French or whatever. Just because they don't know English does not mean that they are unintelligent either. So keeping that in mind when you're providing services, because if you give someone a written homework, for example, if it's in English, they're not necessarily going to understand everything that's being asked in that. So your best bet would be to go over it with the person, with an interpreter, make sure they understand so that they can get the most benefit out of whatever that homework assignment is. Ways of communicating. So with an in-person interpreter, with VRI, which is video remote interpreting, and also there's telephone relay or relayed calls. So in-person interpreter is just like it sounds. The interpreter is going to come sit in the room with both of you. Or it would also be like if you're in a group setting and everybody is on Zoom and the interpreter is on Zoom. Video remote interpreting is where, let's say the person goes into the doctor's office, they don't have an interpreter available right then, let's say it's an emergency room, or you guys have possibly also seen this at like Rite Aid or at the drive-through. So what they do is they sign in to a video remote interpreting, there's an interpreter available, they pop up on the screen. So you've got the screen, the person who is deaf or hard of hearing and needs the interpreter, and then whoever's providing the service. And so then they will interpret the video back and forth. Telephone relay or relayed calls is if somebody were to call you. So let's say you get a phone call from someone wanting an intake, or you have a client who is deaf or hard of hearing and they need to reschedule. You'll get a phone call and they'll say, hi, this is a relayed phone call. The person calling you is someone who uses sign language. And then as you're talking, they will sign to the person and then verbally speak back to you what the person who uses sign language is saying. So devices. So devices are not for everyone. Some people who are deaf or hard of hearing don't use any device. Some people use either hearing aids or a cochlear implant. So I don't know, can you guys see my mouse if I move it? Okay, so this first one here is a cochlear implant. And then the other image here is a hearing aid. So cochlear implants require surgery. And what it is there is a device that they, obviously I'm not a doctor, but the gist is they drill a hole in your skull, put in the device because and it also depends on the level of hearing or hearing loss that you have. And then there's going to be a magnetic piece that hooks to the outside of the head, as well as a piece that looks like a hearing aid. Some people will have these for one ear, some people will have them for both ears. So there's a couple of different device options. With a cochlear implant, that also impacts things that people can do. So I think there's different things like you can't swim with it on, different if you had like an MRI and those kinds of things, that's going to impact it. Okay, so Nicole's comment. Yes, so Nicole said, I have friends in the deaf community that see cochlear implants as controversial or medically dangerous and unnecessary. So there is a lot of controversy about that. Some of that controversy goes along with the feeling like deafness needs to be fixed, like the person is broken. So it's very much a personal choice. There's also a lot of controversy on children getting cochlear implants because of the possible fatalities during the surgery. So again, personal choice. As a parent, we all know that parenting is hard regardless. So trying to, walk that line and figure out what's best for your child, your family. But yes, cochlear implants are very controversial for sure. Thank you, Nicole, for that. All right, communicating when you don't know sign language. So let's say you have somebody come in and you greet them at the door, and a lot of times what they will do is they will point to their ear and shake their head so that you know that they aren't able to hear. A lot of times it used to be they would do a hand motion like writing, like if you can give me something to write with, I can let you know what I need. Now with cell phones, a lot of times they will open up like the notepad and type back and forth what they're trying to ask or communicate. So there's options of writing back and forth, using cell phones with the notepad or texting, and then possibly lip reading if the person knows how to lip read. However, only about a third of what is said is able to be understood via lip reading. So I do have a video and we're going to see how this works. This is my first time doing a video in this setting. So let's see what happens. Cross your fingers. Wow. All right, bear with me here. Dang it.
You may have to unshare, and then when you share again, to click on the
I see.
share
Okay.
audio.
Whoop. You guys don't see a share screen anymore, correct? Okay. All right. I apologize. Learning experience, right? There's an ad, of course. Okay, can everybody hear that? Cool, thank you, Nicole.
So when I was really young, probably kindergarten or first grade, I have a much older brother, and we'd go out to recess, and there was this older guy, he might have been in like 5th or 6th grade, that always used to pick on us, and I didn't really know what to do about it, and I definitely looked up and completely trusted what my grandma
Today we went to a high school and I pet
I was posing for a picture with all of my girlfriends when all of a sudden one of them reached over.
Can you read my lips?
Can you read
My lips.
Can you read?
Can you read my lips? Can you read her lips?
My dad Clementine loves bread. She stole a loaf off the counter.
Can you read his lips?
I have 2 dogs. One boxer, she's 7.5, and one mixed breed who's 8.
I am deaf, but my word is a hairy one. I rely on the visual, not the auditory. The word lip reading implies reading, like reading a book
whose text is legible and clear.
But the human face isn't a book, and lip reading isn't reading. People mumble, people talk fast and laugh loudly, people have facial hair like porcupines, lips like sphincters, people cover their mouths, people have accents. But real conversations don't take place in a studio.
Growing up, I used to...
I'm putting together a puzzle without all the pieces. I look in on your mouth. I try to grasp with one sense information intended through another. There have been times when I've questioned why I even tried to lip read. The way through this swamp, when I could just use sign language. Some deaf people choose to do just that. It's like a different world. A world filled with rich expression and culture. When people sound, they come alive. But I know I want both worlds. Communication is never a given.
Tuesday, I woke up, had a
And then
rash.
she just pulled my dress down.
When I was little, my family
Everything was
got a
out.
cat.
Like, why don't
Wednesday
you
morning,
just hit him in the
I
face?
held
That
a
was like the last thing that I ever
guinea
would've done.
pig.
Winter I learned
and
how to
2 different
ski.
kinds of
I only cried twice.
But when the reading works, when I focus on one natural face and launch into a conversation, something clicks. Right then, I feel something extraordinary.
Implies
Human
reading
Connection.
Any thoughts about that video?
That was really good. Thank you for sharing that. Put a whole different perspective on it.
Nicole?
I was I was, it was when it first started and the voice started getting like jarbled and stuff, and I was having a hard time hearing. I was like, God, that's frustrating. Like, I feel like I'm missing something. Like, I don't know what they're supposed to be saying. And then I'm like, oh, I get it. I'm supposed to be feeling like that. And then, realizing as I was like watching them speak and the constant interference and things like that, how absolutely frustrating it must be to not get clear, like have clear sentences, clear statements. Like I know that when we listen to things on Zoom and someone has bad reception and you're only picking up like 2 or 3 words, how frustrating that is to try to figure out what they're trying to say. And I guess it probably must feel like that when you're trying to read lips or somebody doesn't know sign language and you just feel like you're listening to that constant jarbled half half heard sentences. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad. I saw a couple faces at first. I'm like, I wonder how many people think that like our internet is messing up, but thank you, Nicole. Zakia.
Yeah, so I was thinking kind of like the similar thing. I already know, like, when somebody tries to yell across from me in a busy room, I'm like, I can't read lips. You're gonna have to. I'm already hard as hearing as is. But I just know like the frustration of if someone tells you that you're deaf and if they don't know sign language, they kind of automatically assume or expect you to be able to read lips, which isn't. That's not really fair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. One of the things too, mentioned, and it showed somebody with facial hair, but think about somebody too that has, even if someone is phenomenal at lip reading, think about some people that have like a huge amount of facial hair, like big, huge mustache and beard, and you can barely see their mouth. So that would be, add even more to it, or thin lips, or, there's a whole number of things. Go ahead, Zakia.
I think that was also a problem during the pandemic when everybody was wearing masks, and they some of them had see-through masks so that they can be able to read lips for those that does. But I know that was a huge barrier during that time.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you mentioned that. So there were so I had a consumer during the pandemic towards the end who is deaf and uses sign language, and I had luckily had time to order some masks with the little clear window in it. However, a lot of times they fog up, even if they say they're anti-fogging, but they're not readily available like the other surgical masks were. The other option would maybe have been a face shield, but again, those two after a while will fog up. Okay, go ahead, Caitlin.
Sorry, swooping in at the last second. Yeah, no, it made me think that it seems like people who are deaf have to be proficient at like multiple languages. Like I never considered before how like even if you are super good at reading lips, it's like different languages almost each person. Like I did not even think about accents. Like I have a hard time even understanding those, being able to hear, let alone like thinking about the mouth moving differently or how some people might mumble, and so it seems like we would be expecting them then to like know sign language, but also know, English and know everybody's different ways of speaking it. And now I feel like more ignorant, but I'm also grateful to be able to realize that that's unrealistic and not something that should be considered. But I mean, you don't think about these things until it's like brought to your attention. So this was cool.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. And it kind of jogged my memory too. I didn't put this in the presentation, but something as far as deaf culture, thinking about any person who has multiple layers to themselves, which a lot of us do, but so the people in their deaf world, if they are, how do I want to say it? Depending on, everybody's different, right? But identifying as deaf, there's going to be some deaf people who, oh, you're not deaf enough. But then the hearing world wanting you to be, you need to act like you're hearing. And so that whole trying to figure out and the role that can play in your identity as a person. And, a number of us know working in the SUD field, how our identity can really impact us and, you know, just figuring out who we are and as we grow up and the layers of trauma that that can create, and for sure. Okay, let me bring this back up here. Oh, I screwed up. I closed it, so give me just a second. I appreciate everyone's patience while I navigate this.
You're doing awesome. This is great.
Thank you. All right, let me. It's gonna make me open it back up. Okay. We good? Can everybody see it? All right, thank you. Okay, so continuing on with into the SUD and the deaf community. So with the prevalence of substance use disorder in the deaf and hard of hearing community, so about 10% of the general population has a substance use disorder. Research that was reported by the American Addiction Center shows that the prevalence of alcohol use disorder in the deaf and hard of hearing community is at least the same, if not higher, than that of their hearing counterparts. The National Library of Medicine reports that in general, people with disabilities, so not just deafness, deaf and hard of hearing, but disabilities as a whole, report higher rates of substance use disorders than non-disabled persons. The difficulty with this is there are not exact numbers out there because collecting information from the deaf and hard of hearing community is very difficult. So a lot of it is based on self-report, and the number of people in the deaf and hard of hearing community who are receiving services or seek services is much lower. So there's a lack of people in the services for the agencies to be able to report it. And then also the self-reporting is limited, but then census where they collect a lot of the information are in English. And so we just kind of talked about that, how English is not a lot of people who are deaf or hard of hearing, it's not their first language. So then there's the barrier with that to be able to accurately fill in the information and report it. And also a lot of them require verbal communication. And so they get missed or overlooked in that regard. So then there's also the risks. So people in the deaf or hard of hearing community have additional risk factors. So limited family discussion. So if they live in a family where everyone else in the family is hearing, they're deaf, some families, communication is amazing. Unfortunately, it is more common that there is a lack of communication between the hearing family members and the deaf family member. So in that, there's limited discussion about, you know, the whole just say no, and if your friends offer you drugs or alcohol, or having those conversations don't always happen or exist. So decreased exposure to prevention programs because of lack of either people who know sign language providing the services or interpreters for the services, decreased family support, self-esteem and identity. So we talked about that a little bit. Often if the person who is deaf or hard of hearing uses sign language and the other people in the home do not, that can create some isolation, which can impact self-esteem, identity, increased risk for social isolation, higher rates of experiencing child abuse and sexual assault. Unfortunately, children with disabilities, children who are deaf or hard of hearing, child abuse and sexual assault is more common. Some of that is they don't tell, they don't have somebody who they can adequately communicate with to tell them what is going on. Barriers in SUD treatment in the deaf and hard of hearing community. So trouble obtaining treatment. So finding qualified treatment centers who either have people on staff that know sign language, making contact with treatment centers. So a lot of times like trying to call a place. So let's say you're a deaf or hard of hearing person, so you have to use the telephone relay. So you call an office. Well, now it's all the automated press this to try to get to anybody. So navigating all of that and then finally talking to somebody. Some people have difficulty knowing how to work with a telephone relay and understanding that navigation. So the back and forth, sometimes there is miscommunication. So the person who's interpreting may misinterpret what the person on the phone said. Sometimes the person who is deaf or hard of hearing might feel like the person interpreting is not adequately interpreting what they're saying as far as their questions. And then because of the nature of American Sign Language, and I should have mentioned this before, lip reading is part of it, even if that is not the main focus. They will use lip reading as they're watching somebody sign too, to kind of fill in some of that. Facial expressions are super huge. So somebody who is hearing, who uses verbal communication and their voice, we have pitch and tone and inflection and all of that to communicate, whereas a deaf person relies on facial expressions to know the mood, the type of whether it's a question or a comment. So that can also make it difficult, and often people find it very frustrating trying to navigate services. And so then that can also make it difficult to obtain services. Lack of qualified interpreters. This is a big one. Unfortunately, not all interpreters are created equal. So there's different levels of interpreting. And so depending on what level that person has, the person receiving the services and relying on an interpreter might not get the same information. Sometimes it's a little more watered down than other times. Any of you who have done groups with an interpreter there, I know that I've had some people mention to me that they can tell the difference sometimes in well, so-and-so was more vocal or shared way more in this group than this group, or sometimes you can just kind of pick up. And so then that unfortunately can also cause issues with how the person who is deaf or hard of hearing is portrayed, because if they're sharing all of this information, but then the interpreter is not accurately conveying all of that, it might look like the person doesn't understand or isn't engaged or what have you. SUD treatment providers lacking knowledge and understanding about the deaf and hard of hearing community. So that can play a huge role, no different than any other type of cultural competency. If you feel like the place you're trying to seek services doesn't understand you, doesn't have knowledge about, part of your culture, that can make it difficult as well for you to engage in services, stay in services, seek out services. In 2009, SAMHSA reported that there are only 5 inpatient and 4 outpatient treatment providers that offer services for deaf individuals. And then another one is lack of interpreted 12-step meetings. So let's say you are someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, you rely on sign language, you go to a SUD treatment center, and your counselor or therapist is like, I know what might help. Why don't you try some meetings? Why don't you try some 12-step or other meetings? And then trying to find a meeting where there is a sign language interpreter is difficult. Luckily, now we have more options since COVID with Zoom, that there are meetings online for people who use sign language. The other flip side of that is the deaf world is very small. And so everybody knows everybody knows everybody's business. A lot of people like to gossip. And so some people will shy away from 12-step meetings because of that. That's part of that can be part of the deaf culture is being nosy, asking questions, wanting to know things. And sometimes when people are seeking services, that's very uncomfortable. And even the looking at it from the perspective of, well, they are also there for help. It's not as, there's not as much autonomy as what there should be. So there are some links to different 12-step meetings. So there's AA, and then there's also, I can't, DODA. I'm just trying to remember what that stands for, but it's based in, it's a program that's based in Ohio. And it is my brain just went blank on me. Deaf. They're all of the people involved are deaf. And I cannot think of the name of it. I just recently found out about this meeting, and so I don't know a lot about it, but I wanted to include it because it looked like a good resource. Okay, any questions before I move into talking about the ADA?
I will just say that I do follow a deaf recovery community on Facebook, and just for me, just to kind of understand and see the needs and things like that. And I really enjoy how they do a lot of their meetings and their sobriety celebrations and different things like that. So there is a deaf recovery community on Facebook.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, so ADA laws. What are ADA laws? The ADA laws are the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it is a federal civil rights law which prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. This law was passed in 1990 and guarantees that people with disabilities have the same opportunities as everyone else to enjoy employment opportunities, purchase goods and services, and participate in state and local government programs. So just a little bit about this. Please make sure that you are also getting information from your own agencies as far as like recipient rights and where your agency might fall under the ADA laws, because there's different categories. So ADA laws regarding effective communication. The ADA requires that Title II entities, which would be state and local governments, and Title III entities, which are businesses and nonprofit organizations that serve the public, communicate effectively with people who have communication disabilities. Covered entities must provide auxiliary aids and services when needed to communicate effectively with people who have communication disabilities. The key to communicating effectively is to consider the nature, length, complexity, and context of the communication and the person's normal methods of communication. The rule applies to communicating with the person who is receiving the covered entity's goods or services, as well as with the person's parent, spouse, companion, in appropriate circumstances. So auxiliary aids and services. For people who are deaf, have hearing loss, or are deafblind, this includes providing a qualified note taker, a qualified sign language interpreter, oral interpreter, cued speech interpreter, or tactile interpreter, real-time captioning, written materials, or a printed script of a stock speech, such as given on a museum or historic house tour. This could include video relay service or video remote interpreting. A qualified interpreter means someone who is able to interpret effectively, accurately, and impartially, both receptively, so understanding what the person with the disability is saying, and expressively, meaning having the skill needed to convey information back to that person, using any necessary specialized vocabulary. So an example with that would be there are different levels of interpreters for medical appointments, legal proceedings, mental health, So it's not a one size fits all. Some people might not be qualified to interpret in court, for example. Title II entities are required to give primary consideration to the choice of aid or service requested by the person who has a communication disability. The state or local government must honor the person's choice unless it can demonstrate that another equally effective means of communication is available, or that the use of the means chosen would result in a fundamental alteration or in an undue burden. The public entity still has an obligation to provide an alternative aid or service that provides effective communication if one is available. So if if the agency determines that it's an undue burden, that doesn't mean that you just don't have to provide any kind of effective communication. Title III entities are encouraged to consult with the person with a disability to discuss what aid or service is appropriate. The goal is to provide an aid or service that will be effective given the nature of what is being communicated and the person's method of communicating. The ADA places responsibility for providing effective communication, including the use of interpreters, directly on covered entities. They cannot require a person to bring someone to interpret for him or her. A covered entity can rely on a companion to interpret in only 2 situations. So a covered entity can rely on the person who is deaf or hard of hearing and uses an interpreter. The only time that they can use a companion is under these 2 situations. So 1, an emergency situation involving imminent threat to the safety or welfare of an individual or the public. Or 2, in situations not involving an imminent threat, an adult accompanying someone who uses sign language may be relied upon to interpret or facilitate communication when A, the individual requests this, B, the accompanying adult agrees, and C, reliance on the accompanying adult is appropriate under the circumstances. This exception does not apply to minor children. Any questions? If there's hands raised, I can't see it. Nope, I think we're good. Okay. Interpreting. So when is an interpreter needed? Anytime that the person needs to give informed consent. Examples: intake, signing releases of information. So someone can't give informed consent if they don't fully understand everything that they're giving consent to. And so that's why they have to have an interpreter for those situations. Another one is being presented with information. So individual counseling sessions, group therapy, and meetings. And this is pertaining to in an SUD setting. That's what this is focused on. Etiquette when working with an interpreter. So the interpreter is there to facilitate communication. That is their sole purpose. They are not there as a member of the team working with the person. They are just there to communicate what you're saying and communicate what the person who is deaf or hard of hearing is saying. The interpreter will usually need to be near whoever is speaking. So normally, so if it's in an individual session, they are probably going to sit right next to you. Unless sometimes the person who is deaf or hard of hearing might have a different preference. So it's the reason for that is they're going to be looking at you as you're talking and also looking at the interpreter. So versus having to look back and forth or across the room. When working with someone who uses an interpreter, look at the individual when speaking and not at the interpreter. So really act like the interpreter's not there. You're still communicating to that person. Speak to the individual as if the interpreter's not there. So don't say things like tell him, her, them, whatever. Just speak to them direct. Speak to the individual you're working with directly. The interpreter is responsible for interpreting anything that is said. Do not tell the interpreter not to interpret something. So if you let's say, you say something about the deaf person, the interpreter should still be interpreting that. If someone would have heard you say that, then it should be interpreted. Don't say, oh, don't tell them that, don't interpret that, that's their job. Etiquette when working with an interpreter in a group setting. So the facilitator will need to make sure these items are followed. The participants will need to speak one at a time and clearly. Make it clear who is speaking so that the interpreter can relay who said what. The interpreter might move around the room. So if this is an in-person setting, they might move around the room to be near whoever is talking. In an in-person setting, technology such as a microphone might be used to make it easier for the interpreter to hear and for the interpreter to project their own voice on behalf of the deaf person. In a virtual meeting, ensure that the interpreter is able to be pinned so that they stay with whoever is speaking. This way, the deaf person will not have to search for the interpreter and miss out on information. And then we have some information on various interpreting agencies. There is Communication Access Center, which is in Flushing, Deaf Can, which is in Sylvan Lake out by Detroit, and then Voice Inc., which is in Midland. So if you're in like the Saginaw area, they would be closer. Deaf Can would be closer for like Detroit, Port Huron, Communication Access Center for Genesee County. Accessibility in various levels of care. So just some other things to keep in mind as well. So in inpatient or recovery housing or three-quarter housing, there should be flashing lights for safety. So for fire alarms, doorbells, or if somebody is knocking on the door, the phone ringing, etc. And with new technology, some deaf people can also use things such as, oh, it must have autocorrected and I didn't catch it, Apple Watches that will vibrate to alert them. So now there's other devices like that that will vibrate if there is a fire alarm or things like that. But there still should be, if it's a public building or the public has access, or if they're living there, there still needs to be flashing lights and things for fire alarms, doorbells, different things like that for safety measures. Other information, so cultural competency. In the SUD profession, we often talk about cultural competency. Just like with any other culture, we should not assume something about someone based on one thing that we know about them. It is always best to be person-centered and ask how you can best help or work with each individual. Not every person who is deaf or hard of hearing has the same needs or has had the same experiences. And then also recently 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline added ASL. So to connect directly to a trained 988 Lifeline counselor in ASL, the callers who are deaf, deafblind, deaf disabled, hard of hearing, or late deafened can click the ASL Now button on the website and follow the prompts. Direct dialing to 988 from a video phone will be available in the coming weeks. So this was as of earlier this month. And in the meantime, ASL callers can call 1-800-273-8255 from their video phone and reach ASL services. So, and then here are some references of information that was provided today. So we have time, we have quite a bit of time for questions. I'm going to stop my share screen here. So are there any lingering questions, anything that has not been asked yet?
I have a question. So what happens if we get a client, have a client go into the residential building? Is there somebody on staff who can assist? Or do we call the agency perhaps that our one client uses? How are they supported?
So, it depends on the situation. So what has happened so far that I'm aware of for our specific agency, our specific residential setting, how the part that should always happen is when we get the phone call and we know that the person is deaf or hard of hearing, we should be scheduling an interpreter for the day and time of intake, and that's regardless of what level of care, what component they're going to. Then from there, our residential setting, what they did before was they had interpreters for groups. I'm not sure, I would assume it was every day. I'm not sure if it was. I know for our outpatient or intensive outpatient, we scheduled, you know, working with that person, what days and times, and then we had the interpreter set up ahead of time. Because there's not enough interpreters. It can be difficult to get an interpreter at the last minute. We don't want the person to miss out on services. So scheduling that as far in advance as possible, as many interpreters as possible. Something else to keep in mind is if it is longer than, I believe, an hour, there should be 2 interpreters so that they switch off every 20 minutes so that one person is not getting tired, because as they're getting tired, they're going to miss out on things, right? So then they can switch back and forth. It's very sign language is very labor intensive when you're trying to interpret and keep up with what is being said. So making sure that there's enough outside of groups and individuals, there's not an interpreter with them throughout the day to communicate with their peers or the other residents. So a lot of that would be based on either probably not texting, because in residential you can't have your phone with you, but a lot of writing back and forth and communicating that way. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you. Maybe a visual board also. You know, that could be a good idea too. But yeah, thank you, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
I just think about how like isolating it might feel to be someone, you know, in the deaf community, like immersed in a community that's mainly hearing, and like trying to form those relationships, which really stinks because like recovery is all about community and relationships, and that definitely like strengthens your recovery. Like I don't know that I would be sober today without my people, you know, like I think that would be really, really difficult. So, and at least, I mean, I'm sure that they can find communities, like you shared some and Nicole shared the Facebook one, but it just adds that like extra step when you're already so like, you know, weak in the beginning when you first get sober, like you barely have anything to give, but to have to like seek out recovery and then also seek out a separate individual community that's harder to find and a more niche, smaller. Yeah, I'm just thinking about those struggles and just sympathizing.
Well, and also think about too, you know, I made the comment earlier about how the deaf community is so small. So even though, so like Flint is a bigger city compared to some cities, but so there is a bigger population of deaf and hard of hearing individuals, especially because we have the Michigan School for the Deaf. So that had drawn more people here. A lot of people then stayed because a lot of deaf and hard of hearing people had become employed with GM. So, but it's still small in comparison. And so think about the number of people that they probably used with, right? So trying to find sober people then is it's an even smaller population.
So what has been your experience with learning some sign language without becoming proficient? Because I'm gonna start taking the Oklahoma free online classes, and I just want to know, like, how insulting is it to try and use sign language when you're not proficient at it?
So speaking from my own experience, to back up a little bit, so as Alicia had shared in my bio, I was originally going into sign language interpreting. So I took sign language in high school. I had a friend who was deaf. That's how I first started learning sign language, communicating with her. We had a lot of classes together. So listening to the teacher and watching the interpreter, I learned a lot. And then I took sign language classes for I think like 2.5, 3 in my high school years. So there was that, and then I went into, I was going to do the interpreting program at Mott. So I learned quite a bit there and then didn't use it. And so when I have worked with a deaf individual, I will be open and honest and say, I know some sign language, I know enough to have a conversation. I don't know enough to rely on it for our sessions. So if you're fine with that, we're going to use an interpreter. They're fine with that. The one person I've worked with will laugh at me because I have a hard time of not, like, I want to sign it myself and I like just naturally, and so I will have to sit on my hands sometimes because I don't want them to be watching me and the interpreter. So that can be difficult. But I'm transparent and open and honest, and they will also, this specific person has been open and honest when working with me too about things. So normally if they get here, the interpreter's not here yet, there will be a little bit of just hospitality type conversation. Do you want a water? You know, that kind of stuff. Sometimes they will tell me things if what's going on, so long as they're little stuff they know that I'm able to understand, and I will tell them if I don't. Then once the interpreter gets there is when we talk about the actual important things. As far as wanting to learn, I'm glad that you're taking those classes. Those were the free ones that were offered, right?
Yeah, I was gonna put the link in the chat if you want me to.
No, yes, please. That would be great. Anything is helpful. My experience throughout my life has been that even knowing any little bit of sign language, people who use sign language seem to be very appreciative. Just knowing when to stay in your lane. So obviously, if you don't know enough to have a session, don't, knowing your limits. But still, you know, when you approach someone, you could say, so let's say you're working in an office, a person who is deaf or hard of hearing comes in for a session, you could sign to them, hi, my name is Nicole, how can I help you? And just letting them know, like, off the bat, like, I know a little bit of sign language. Who are you here to see? Or something to that effect. But just being open and honest about the fact that you know a little bit of sign language. Something else that goes along with that too, as far as etiquette, just for some future reference, if anybody learns sign language, is if you see people signing and you are within close proximity, making them aware that you know sign language, so that they know if they're trying to have a private conversation, they're probably assuming most people don't know what they're saying. So just being transparent, I think, is the biggest thing. I have not had, my experience has not been that anybody has been upset, so long as you're open and honest that, you know, your sign language is limited, but that you're also being helpful. Yep. Go ahead, Caitlin.
Thought of two questions while you were sharing about that. And one of them, I was wondering, like, what it's like building rapport with your client who is deaf. Like, if you feel like it's just more difficult because there's kind of that like third person that you have to like, that you're like listening to while trying to look at them, and it just seems like it might be a little bit distracting. So I'm just curious. But then I'm also wondering like how they feel having that third person there. Like, do you think, does it seem like it's harder for them to open up because they're having like a different interpreter rotation sometimes, you know, and that might feel like, well, now a bunch of people know my story, and what is it like?
Those are some good questions. So for the first one, for like my own perception or like my own experience, as far as if it's difficult, so far it has not been. I think it might depend on the person. So far it hasn't been, and I think that that's because someone who uses interpreters has had to rely on them for so much of their life that usually there's still, I guess that kind of is going towards your second question, so let me back up. I think that for me personally, it has not been because of having, like I said, I had a friend in high school who used an interpreter. I do find it frustrating with, I would much rather communicate with the person myself. I would much rather have that direct communication. My personal issue that I have had is because I do know enough sign language to know what they're saying. Where I struggle is my sign language skills or my expressive skills are not up to par to not have an interpreter. So sometimes I will get frustrated if I caught something that the interpreter missed, and so not being judgmental in that. But that's my own stuff, right? I haven't noticed it to create a barrier as far as rapport and relationship building. It's just been my own stuff of I need to go back and finish learning enough to be able to communicate on my own. I can't speak from a perspective of somebody who knows zero sign language because that's not been my experience, but I could see that being difficult. So typically in individual sessions, what I've done is the interpreter is next to me and I will just watch, and you know, the eye contact and all of that. If you take notes during your sessions, you won't really be able to, because the deaf person could perceive that as you not paying attention because they rely so much on eye contact. So that's something to be mindful of. So just to the best of your ability, acting like the interpreter is not there and still doing, you know, the active listening and the eye contact, but still just listening to what the interpreter is saying. Occasionally, the interpreter might ask you for clarification if they're not sure what you meant so that they can accurately convey and interpret to the other person. So it takes some adjusting for sure. In regards to your question about the other person and their autonomy and confidentiality and comfortability, right? Is that okay? So my experience has been that they are sometimes not as open and forthcoming with different interpreters. Depending on the person, they might prefer someone who identifies as male or female based on the information that they're going to be disclosing. I have also noticed that they also have preferences sometimes in regards to the person's level, like skill level in interpreting. There have been times where there's been like, can you call the interpreting agency and tell them, I don't want, you know, this person, I don't want to interpret for me anymore because they're hard to understand, they miss information, they don't accurately convey what I'm saying, different things like that. So that has been one. There's been a few times that I've had to call and say, we don't, unfortunately, I don't want to use that interpreter anymore for XYZ, or they're requesting not to use that interpreter. Sometimes you have to just take what you can get if there's limited people, if it's short notice. So I think it kind of depends. The person I'm working with currently, I think we've built a good enough rapport. But also because the deaf community is small, a lot of times they know some of these interpreters on a personal level, either like sometimes the interpreter's parents are deaf and they know their parents. So yeah, it can definitely impact that, which is another reason why, yeah, I would like to go back and finish myself. Thank you. Those were great questions. I'm glad you said that, or you asked those questions, Caitlin. All right, what else? Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Observations? Any other, let me ask, if anybody's willing to share what your thoughts are on working with someone who is part of the deaf or hard of hearing community.
I'll be honest, I struggled at first when our female client would come, you know, because I speak fast sometimes and she politely does her gestures and, you know, but I never wanted to give her the cold shoulder, like she ain't, you know, but now it's like we have a communication. We communicate back and forth. Like last week she wore some pumpkin pants and I'm like, and she's like, you know, I mean, and also having her in my groups. But yeah, because I guess I didn't know, like, to read the lips. You know, I didn't know if she was able to read lips or, but also knowing her from the past, how I would watch how she communicated with her children. I kind of learned her, but at first I was kind of guarded because I didn't want to insult her, but yeah. And it's challenging at times for the interpreters because you get used to certain interpreters and then you get the one who fills in. It's like, some of the other ones you can like follow along better. I guess, like I've expressed to you before, the facial expressions, like some of them get right into it. There's some just don't do as much as regulars. But
So that's a good, you make a good point. And so that kind of goes along with ASL versus English. So ASL is very, like I said, very visual, but it also relies heavily on facial expressions. And so sometimes, you guys may have seen different things in social media where people will be like, check out this interpreter at popular things, concerts, political things, whatnot. And some of these people are all over the place. They almost look like, some people might think that they're performing, but it's how ASL is. And so it also depends on the person who is utilizing those services and if they are very ASL and where it's very expressive versus something that's a little closer to English where it's more I don't want to say professional, but like from the outside it might look that way. It's not as expressive as far as facial expressions and hand gestures and everything. So no different than a lot of different languages. Some people are more expressive or some people use different slang, different terms. So
I remember working with one particular client who relied on ASL as a coach, and I really wanted to make sure that like she got the resources I was trying to give her, and her interpreter was there. So her interpreter was being our like middleman, I guess. I don't really know how else to describe it, like of our conversation. But I really wanted to make sure like she got this information. It was pertaining to like daycares and other stuff like that was really important for her children. So I made sure to like write it down on a piece of paper so she could have it like a physical copy of what I was trying to say to her too, because I didn't know how it would translate or if it would get lost in translation. So I guess it was like me being unsure, like, how is this going to come across, and just wanting to like make sure proper feedback was being passed. But I feel a lot more comfortable now, like in a group setting, with that individual being in group. Like I really enjoy her being in group. She is so expressive. She has really good concepts, and just like seeing her face light up, like when she's talking and stuff, like you can absolutely, it's like you can hear her voice when she starts signing, and it is the coolest experience ever.
I think that is good that, yes, still writing it down because, I mean, that's good for anybody, right? But I can see that struggle of, since you're not directly like there's a middle person facilitating that communication. So, and if you don't know the language, you don't know for sure that they're, so just you have to rely and trust that this person is accurately conveying the information. So no, I appreciate that you wrote it down too, to make sure that they had it so that it wasn't possibly miscommunicated, misspelled, what have you, or a number, like a wrong number or whatever. No, that's awesome. And I think that the biggest thing that we can do individually when working with someone is making sure that they feel comfortable, welcome, like all the things we should be doing anyways. But if the person potentially already feels like an outsider because of this potential communication barrier, doing the best you can to be friendly and welcoming and inclusive. With anybody who has a communication, difference in communication, difference culturally, anything like that. any kind of difference. I don't have anything else if there are no other questions. And so with that, I thank you, Nicole, for putting that in the chat. I didn't quite catch what it said. Zoom facilitation. Yep, pinning and highlighting. So this is a question. Sometimes I think it depends on the person. I know that pinning, the interpreter will then stay with them. So making sure that if this is the first time you're facilitating a group with that particular person, pin them and then take just a couple minutes at the beginning of a group and say, hey, I want to make sure our person who's here who uses the interpreter, that we're good to go. And just ask, make sure, and let them know that if for whatever reason it's not working, to have them make sure that they let you know that. I think it also depends on the device they're using. Sometimes it doesn't always work the same. So if the person is using a phone, a tablet, a laptop, it might not work the same or from device to device. The other thing too is when doing a share screen, making sure. Did you have some,
Yes.
Nicole?
Well, I just, so can you pin an interpreter to the client, or does it pin the interpreter for everybody?
So if you pin them, I think it,
Or maybe it's highlight.
I think it's pin, that's what I was told by the interpreters, but if you pin them, they stay at the beginning. So that then I think it's the same for everybody though, but then that way whoever's talking, they're next to whoever's talking.
Okay.
I think it looked like Megan unmuted. Do you have experience?
So they had once told me that they want to be pinned and then multi-pin. So you pin them and then you click again and you click multi-pin on both interpreters. So then they both come together so they both can be seen. That's what they had told me once during group, and I said okay, I didn't question it, and I just do it every group now that I run with interpreters in it, and I don't seem to have any issues with it.
Thank you. Yeah, I have limited experience with that and was basing it off of just what the interpreting agency had told me, but like with anything, each person might have a different preference on how it works, and then trial and error. Sometimes things are different in practice than on paper.
Were you saying that like there's multiple interpreters in group? Because I haven't done a group with this person. So like do you pin them together, but then do you pin the client with them?
No. Nope, you don't pin the client at all. You only pin the interpreters.
But like wouldn't we, just based on like what you shared in your presentation, everything, like wouldn't it make more sense to have them next to each other? Because like you want it to feel like it's the client talking, as opposed to like then everyone's attention is on the interpreter and not looking at the client.
So when that is a good point. So the main purpose of pinning is so that the interpreter can see whoever's talking and the interpreter, like either the facilitator when they're presenting the information or the other clients when they're sharing as well. But you do have a point that if the person who is deaf and hard of hearing is signing, since they're not verbally speaking, there's no sound, and they're not gonna, like right now how I'm yellow. That's a good point. They've never expressed that, because otherwise you're just going to see the interpreter. That's a good point. I didn't think about that. Thank you for that. Chelsea.
I was gonna say, I have that on Friday, because she comes to group on Friday, and she has asked me, has asked me to pin her to do the multiple pin, the both interpreters and her, so that it's easier for her to follow the interpreter.
Okay, that would be good. I'm surprised she hasn't said that. Or
yeah, that's why I assumed. I'm like, she has direct messaged me and asked me to pin her or give her multiple pins so that she could do that too.
Okay. All right, any other closing thoughts or questions before I turn it back over to Alicia? Well, thank you everyone for joining me today and for all of the great questions and comments.
Did a great job. I got a lot out of that and a better understanding, and I think I'm more culturally competent for the deaf community than before. So thank you.
All set. Okay, did a great job. We definitely want to thank you for doing your presentation today. I want to thank everybody else for joining as well. I'm going to put a survey link up in the chat box really quick. I just sent that out. If you guys don't mind filling that out, let Nicole kind of know how she did and what you guys learned and stuff like that. That would be greatly appreciated. And also that will be a way for you guys to get your certificate of completion. We do these presentations monthly. So the next one's going to be on October 17th, and it's going to be with Sarah Shaw. She'll be presenting the 8 dimensions of wellness, a holistic approach to treatment planning and clinician self-care. You can register for that on our Facebook page. You can go to anti-stigma at odysseyvillage.com. The registration link for that will be open here shortly within the next probably 24 hours. There will be flyers sent out. I'm not quite sure how all of you guys received your information, but I'm glad you did. And I just want to thank you guys for coming today and listening to all the good stuff that we were able to hear. Does anybody have anything that they would like to add or say or anything before we close out? I want to give you guys a few minutes to click on that link and get that survey so you guys can get your completion certificate. And if you guys have any questions at all about anything, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. 810-937-5366. The anti-stigma at odysseyvillage.com. Other than that, we appreciate all of you guys for coming and attending and taking time out of your day to do this presentation. I want to thank you guys again. Have a good day, everybody.